I'm Pere Monclus, the CTO at NSBU in the Network and Security Business Unit. I'm fairly recent to the VMware family, but that doesn't mean that I have not been in kind of this transformation from a networking point of view for a while. I did it before in different capacities, and I met some of you in the past. So I'll start a little bit on when I got here, how VMware has been explaining the story so far, right? And you've seen this slide for the last couple of years, and in the sense that networking should be this Uber thing that as we transform into the new world should connect everything. But I would like to touch a bit on how we got there and what are the implications in terms of where are we going. The first thing is networking has been there for like many, many years. And somehow it was kind of this end-to-end principle that you would connect a machine to another machine and everything would work nicely. And the flows of information were predictable. The identities were IP addresses. You could place things in the physical network, firewalls, load balancers, and so on. But what happened is that certain things start to move. Like virtualization was the first one with kind of VMs jiggling between layer 2 boundaries and in some cases layer 3 boundaries. And that led that some of the controls and policies and elements that we wanted to attach to the network infrastructure start to be more complicated. And when I talk about networking, usually it's about not only connectivity, but connectivity, security, and elasticity, the load balancing aspect. So in that aspect, we started focusing on what was the VMware role within the fact that vSphere is a virtualization platform, and what would be the meaning of networking in there. And these were the early days of network virtualization from a VMware point of view, where we had kind of the virtual suites, the distributed virtual suites with VCNS, and eventually the appearance of network virtualization in that part of the data center. Of course, networking is never about a single compute infrastructure. And immediately it was obvious that we had to go across multiple hypervisors, across bare metals, across different things. And if you see, this is the emergence of NSXT. And at some point, we are going to talk about NSXV versus NSXT and how the transition from a vSphere-based centric infrastructure to a kind of a more universal concept emerges. Of course, then, you have that the second transformation that influenced a lot all this movement was the fact that applications are going to cloud. And we are going to talk a little bit about what do we see in terms of how do we approach cloud from an infrastructure point of view, and how do we tackle the container aspect a little bit later. But if you think what's the most fundamental thing that has driven this transformation, and it's the fact that instead of thinking in terms of infrastructure or network infrastructure as an entity by itself, we've pivoted in terms of the centerpiece is the application. Now we do things in terms of how do we bring agility? How do I deploy my applications faster? If I deploy my applications faster and they move around, how do I follow them in terms of security policies? How do I achieve common infrastructure across environments? So if you see the three pillars that we've seen in terms of these transformations being used by our customers is the notion of security in terms of how do we follow our compute workloads as they appear and they move around from a microsegmentation point of view or from a security point of view. But at the same time, how do I do it in an automated fashion? How do I have like an environment that is consistent across multiple of them? So this somehow has been the beginning of these things. Now, as we go towards who consumes these applications, I mean, so far, if we are talking between an application in the data center and another in the data center, everything is self-contained. We go to cloud. We go to the container services, but at the same time, we have to remember that applications are used by some sort of user. And traditionally at VMware, we've had a lot of enterprise customers, and a lot of the end users tend to be like employees of a corporation, users of a specific internal service, and so on. And this is where we started looking about how do we integrate with the end user aspect of it, with things like AirWatch and user compute, or the VDI elements on being able to tag and carry the information of who you are towards the data center and have an end-to-end story. But there was a little bit more. There was the fact that a lot of people have branch offices, retail, banking, and now how do you bring this story of putting all the pieces together beyond the data center, beyond the cloud into different elements? Even if this slide has been presented many, many times for the last couple of years, somehow was a direction. I mean, we were aspiring to go there, we were looking to go there, but it was kind of a work in progress as we were going from on-prem to cloud to containers to end devices. So we started thinking, what do we do in order to continue into our journey towards that original vision? And if you think, we still have lots of things to do in the data center, we still things have to do in the cloud, and especially in the data center, if we double click, going in towards what are the apps that people are using today, what are the VMs, what are the containers, and so on, is what evolution do we bring into the on-premises data center in a way that we start satisfying some of the use cases that we need. And this is where we'll talk a little bit about the evolution inside the data center from virtualization to containers to different type of applications. But at the same time, we've been asked a lot on what's going on in the NFV market, what's going on into different segments that would benefit out of network virtualization layers. And that is one of the pillars that we are focusing. As we go forward, public cloud, it's a combination of two elements. One is like, how do I let my enterprise strategy of cloud first or hybrid cloud? How do I create the controls, the monitoring, the operational aspect on a consistent environment between the two of them? And the third pillar was, as we were discussing, this edge compute. So somehow we double click on this edge compute element, and we realized that in one aspect with the notion of how do we tag information coming from BDIs and endpoints, we had something that we could kind of address the requirement, but our customers were demanding a little bit more. And this is where from the current strategy that was about how do we bring data center and cloud together, we realized that we had a gap in the middle. Now, for the moment, we call this, let's say, the edge. We have the data center, we have the cloud, and we have this edge element that means many things right now, and that it can extend essentially from what happens in your remote office, what happens into your end users, or what's coming even in the future. And based on the feedback that we were getting, we decided, as was discussed before, to pursue enhancing the portfolio, enhancing the offering with the acquisition that we had announced around Bello Cloud. One of the sections is going to be to spend much more time on this. Of course, as you can imagine, this is one of the significant news from a VMware and from an NSBU point of view, because it shows this moment where networking doesn't not only work across multiple compute environments, but starts going towards where the customers are. And listening to our customers, essentially we are putting an end-to-end solution that addresses that. Now, going back to the first slide of the original vision, as you can imagine, the interesting thing is how do you start rationalizing all these elements? Now we are extending in terms of networking, connectivity, security, going from the branch to the data center to the cloud. And the journey ahead of us is how we are going to rationalize all these things to put it in a consistent and common environment. Now, if you think this is still from a networking point of view, the beginning of the journey. I mean, in here you have that we have the crossroads of saying what happens into the data center wall, what's happening in the networking wall, how do we understand security, how do we understand like operations, how do we understand cloud, cross-cloud, but it's much more than that. I mean, we have two vectors that are happening at the same time. The first one is this notion of reinvention and rediscovery of networking in terms of how do we simplify operations and how we make everybody more efficient. And this always without compromising the security part of it and the operational element. But there is much more than that. The transformation that we are seeing is applications are being reinvented. Applications are being rewritten in cloud. Container frameworks are appearing. Lambda frameworks are appearing. So essentially what we see is that we started the journey many years ago. I mean, we started in a moment of network virtualization, but at the beginning it was kind of following what was happening in the compute element. We were going from physical servers to virtual machines. We needed to do something in order to provide the proper connectivity for that segment. And the notion of virtual switches appeared. From there, of course, there was the discovery of network virtualization as an element or as a framework of thinking that would give you much more. But as the embracement of these concepts start to happen, what we see is like an explosion of innovations and things that have happened. And this we went from the early days of finding the specific use cases that would resonate from a network virtualization point of view, and this was the discovery of network microsegmentation. But immediately it went into, oh, what about operations? What about discovery? How do I understand what I have in my network? How do I monitor? How do I have a feedback loop that what I discover signals into my microsegmentation story what I should be protected? Of course, if I cannot automate, everything is very nice, but it's not that useful. So immediately we went into the automation phase. Customers started to embrace cloud, so we are now with the NSXT creating kind of an end-to-end story that addresses the cloud, and we'll cover that too. And now we start getting into the next phase. What we are seeing is that when you have that this network substrate starts to percolate between private cloud, public cloud, containers, and so on, we have kind of this common infrastructure layer that gives you like an operational principle that you understand infrastructure in a common sense. But then you have something completely different, which is like the past frameworks, the new ways of rewriting applications are coming top-down in a completely different mindset, which essentially is like, I don't understand necessarily fundamental networking principles. I'm understanding applications. So in this space, what we started seeing is that the meaning of how do I secure my applications? How do I understand what does it mean connectivity between applications start to be redefined? And this is where now we are embracing kind of this new phase of the journey, where we are looking at how do we go up the stack, especially into this cloud and application transformation. The first thing that we introduced in this VMware was app security, app defense product line. So probably you saw the announcements. We are very excited about that. And essentially it's this notion that's saying, if now I can have an element that tells me not only who's talking to who, not only how am I going to secure it with micro-segmentation and groups, but I'm going to start understanding who launched that process. Is that process compromised because the hash, the MD5 hash of the process has changed? Is the library linked to that process updated up to speed? Who launched that process? Is it in the Windows registry or not? So as we go towards the app security, we are kind of developing a new set of portfolio tools that are giving you that visibility and that understanding of what's going on in your application. And then, of course, it gets tied to the infrastructure that we have underneath in terms of how the network extends across multiple environments to make sure that you have a consistent environment from a security and operations. Now, if we go to the next level, is what we are discussing a few seconds ago, is it's not just about the application sitting in the data center or the cloud, but at the same time is how do you reach to those applications? How do you connect to the remote offices, to the endpoints? And that's one of the pillars that now we are starting into our journey, investing heavily and making it happen. And this is part of the topics we'll cover more in detail today. And then we get to the next step. I mean, if you think lots of interesting things are happening in the community right now, especially in the open source world, and we are working on this closely, but what we are seeing is that the understanding of communications is going at what APIs are you accessing, what elements in terms of data accesses, what specific tables, what specific objects. And if we start thinking in terms of how are we going to rationalize an infrastructure that now I have it across 3 cloud providers, few private data centers across the globe. Now, if we start thinking what does policy mean in that new universe? It's like fairly daunting to understand how am I going to express policies saying this specific compute element, doesn't matter what type of compute element, can talk to that specific compute element, especially when you distribute it around the world. So we are spending a lot of time on interacting with our customers and getting their experiences, but what we are seeing is that there is a new kind of way to understand policy in terms of how is data moving across your applications. I mean, if the policy could be simplified in a way that you start thinking, is this specific data sensitive enough that should never leak across certain boundaries? And from there, you have to infer the intent. It's like, do we need to make sure that the specific application server and database can talk or cannot talk? Or do we have to carry tainting of the information in a way that we can essentially create a risk assessment of what's going on in the network? So we are barely entering into this new stage of evolution, but we are very excited in terms of how the fact that NSX is kind of this substrate that connects from the physical wall to the virtual wall, to the container wall, to the cloud wall, gives us this kind of platform that we can explore all these directions that are going on in the industry. One of the talks is going to be specific digging about NSXT and containers, and that we are going to explain some of the elements that we are doing today, and then we can cover some of the crazy thoughts that we have for the future too. So, any question? Okay. So going back to what we were saying is, as the infrastructure becomes more and more relevant to the business, and this is what we were discussing about, I have to become more agile into deploying my applications. I have to make sure that they are properly secure. I have to make sure that they run across multiple environments or they're ready for the cloud. What happens is that the problem is getting elevated. It's like, how do I create an environment that my users, the people that access my application, are part of the definitions that I understand in my network? How do I make sure that the remote offices or the elements or the IoT elements that are going to be part of my application are properly rationalized and understood within the policy framework that I think? How do I make sure that wherever my application is, hybrid, public, private, it keeps following my application? And we started to look at these topics in terms of what are the fundamental elements that we have to go beyond the original vision. If you remember the first slide and the presentations in the past years, the original vision was we have to make sure that NSX is this framework that connects everything to everything, that goes from the on-prem to the cloud, from the VMs to the containers, from the physical. Now, as we go up, we start realizing that it's not just connect. Connect is just the basic capabilities that we have. Is how do I understand identity? Is the next wave to understand identity based on strong identities, cryptographical identities? Do I need encryption between all the endpoints with some sort of mutual authentication? Do I have ability to understand not only who you are, but where are you, what role are you behaving on, and understanding the location where you are and apply policies based on that or based on the data you are accessing? So as we redefine connectivity in this kind of new world, that everything is about putting the applications together, essentially we are going to the elements that are becoming important for our customers. And this is understanding identity, understanding policy based on not only the elements that I have in my infrastructure, but the things that I do care in terms of data or information that is valuable to me. And of course, creating this element that is scalable across clouds. Not to mention that in order to drive a transition from the existing world to the new world, what's going to happen is that there's a lot of things to understand and rationalize of what I have right now. So this is where we are investing a lot in terms of analytics and visibility with products like VRNI or Wavefront, in terms that I need to discover what I have to understand what's the easiest path to transform in the future and what are the first elements that I will transition. And of course, there's always going to be the notion of connectivity and availability that I have to provide across multiple environments. So as you can see, the picture has not changed. The vision is still the same. It's like we are connecting things in the new world. We are following the application. But at the same time, the picture is becoming much more rich because as we go to up the stack and as we start having more implications in terms of what are the elements that I have in cloud, what are the resources or assets that I'm putting in different locations, the connectivity meaning is increasing and going to a much more sophisticated and refined thing. And this is the place where we are taking NSX in our journey. So today, we are starting to rationalize this thing in kind of these three buckets. Until now, we've been always talking about NSXV and NSXT and kind of how NSXV started in vSphere, NSXT going to being a multi-environment, multi-hypervisor, multi-platform, multi-cloud. And now with the acquisition of Velo, we are introducing the notion of the SD-WAN bucket. Of course, as the journey progresses, the two elements have to be integrated for an end-to-end experience, and this is what we are trying to do at the operational level, at the control, at the policy, and rationalizing this with what's going on in the cloud. So what we've done essentially is like going from an abstract picture where NSX was this concept that was connecting everything, and starting to focus and double-click into different pillars. And what you will see over the course of the presentations is double-clicking at least on what's going on with NSX in the cloud and the Velo. And then we'll double-click on the third section, which is going to be the security elements of NSX and how the base that we have created in terms of the microsegmentation, the disaster recovery, and the automation, how it's going to expand across all of them. And of course, what we are touching as we go up the stack, the notion of security and understanding of deeper concepts is something pervasive across all the elements. Any questions so far? Correct? No?
No, it's all fairly linear, at least to me anyway. Mm-hmm. The idea that VMware is very consistent about you built the VMware, the ESX, and then NSX added the extended ESX escape, mm-hmm. and then NSX moved from there into security. Well, that was always telegraphed from the very beginning, mm-hmm. and so now you just keep building out the product. Mm-hmm. In a sense, you never surprise me. You do exactly what I think you would do.
In broad scope.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, it's not that linear in the sense that if you think the vSphere ecosystem and putting that as the end a network virtualization layer, absolutely. But then when you start like going towards hypervisors and to cloud, it's linear not because it's VMware, it's linear because it's a networking concept. It's essentially you have to connect everything.
Sorry, I'm talking about as a marketing strategy, the idea that NSX in the data center, the obvious thing is to add security to NSX. Once you've got NSX and security, the obvious thing is to extend it into the WAN, right?
Of course.
And so obviously VeloCloud follows that. So once you've got that, the obvious thing is then to say, well, how can I get from end to end? And the answer is get inside the container. So that's where the smart NICs comes from. So in broad scope, that's where it comes from.
Which may be a good thing. Infrastructure is something that moves slowly. We have to do it one step at a time.
Predictable is a feature, not a bug.
Yes.
Yes.
Now, the surprising thing probably is the discussions we are having about going up the stack.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a much more rich environment, especially with the advent of service meshes and all the kind of Istio and Envoy movement.
Yeah, I saw that. I didn't call it out though.
Yes. So that is a place where we are thinking that there may be a non-linearity, and we are working actively on the things that we can develop on top. I mean, if you think what's happening is when you have the private cloud, as you say, is kind of careful, measure, linear growth in terms of strategy, in terms of product portfolio, in terms of value. That is the main strategy. And then you have things that are like wild, like what's going on on top of cloud, what's going on across multi-cloud. And in there has to be a much more radical movement because the kind of slow and predictable approach, at some point it may not be what is expected when you go to an app.
Yeah, I disagree because I think most of the problems in the cloud are pretty obvious.
Yes.
As soon as you get to the cloud, you go like, ooh, that's not so great.
Yes.
And so, things like service meshes are a reaction to the fact that the cloud's not that great.
Yes.
And you've got this problem that you can't solve once you actually get serious.
Yes, but at the same time, it has the nonlinearity maybe on who's the consumer.
Yeah.
Like when you start thinking in terms of infrastructure, you have a specific team that cares about that. The service mesh, the containers, what's coming top-down, traditionally has been a different team.
Yeah.
And where it blends is kind of in the middle on this secure ops environment, where you still have to find some way to understand policy, to rationalize it, but still not break the agility. So what we see is that there is an opportunity and an angle that blends the two worlds together.
Okay, yeah, I hear what you're saying. You're saying the developers are going to buy service meshes, not the infrastructure people.
The developers may assume it's there. They may not buy it in the sense that it may be already part of their past frameworks. And now the question is how to make sure that you integrate it to the IT tissue that you have created over the years, at least from a security and operations point of view.
I think it's much more messy. I think most developers don't even know what a network is. And they're either going to just miss it out entirely and then it's going to be retrofitted like we do now, or they're going to just turn to a networking advisor and say, how do I solve this problem using the network?
And we see service mesh and one of these elements as the translation layer. Because in one side, you don't understand, you don't care, you don't need to know. On the other, you can bring a lot of the security policies, operations.
Service meshes are a reaction to a problem.
Exactly.
It's a viral response.
Exactly.
I've got a problem.
Yes.
Instead of actually doing it properly, they invented a whole new way of doing it that makes no sense.
Yes. And now from our point of view, as you're saying, we have a very consistent strategy on what we are doing. And suddenly there is this opportunity to be even more interesting into different spaces, but at the same time to find how two operational teams bridge into the middle and unify some problem, like the specific problem of security and visibility. Absolutely. Yeah. Good. So having said that, I just wanted to summarize with this last slide. What we see is that the focus continues to be the same. I mean, if you think the transition that we are having coming from more like a infrastructure separated from applications and siloed teams and specific culture on how things happen based on ticketing systems, this is breaking up because at the end of the day, what matters is agility, security, and so on towards delivering an app. The end goal is not infrastructure for the sake of infrastructure. And as such, what we see is kind of the different phases that we've been. The first one is like, okay, how do I convert infrastructure? How do I have an environment that gives me a little bit more simplicity and agility in order to deploy what I want to do? And we went through that phase. And this was kind of the early values of the discovery of network virtualization. Then we go one level up and say, okay, fine, I understand that I can virtualize it. I understand that it's much easier now to do these things. But unless I automate it and I have predictable processes integrated with CI/CD pipelines and so on, it's still fairly manual. So we had to go through the automation phase. And we see a lot of this going on right now. Now we are kind of in this boundary that cloud is happening, and not one, many clouds, and private clouds and public clouds and different type of computes. So we are getting into this stage of how do we make it work across all the environments. And of course, going up to the discussion we were having about native cloud applications and service meshes, is now we are going cloud native. The new applications, how do you build them? How do you view them? How do you create the new workflows between the app dev teams and infrastructure teams? And this is kind of the boundary that now we are exploring and working hard on that. But again, it's always about the app. It's always about delivering kind of a secure substrate, secure infrastructure for the app, regardless where it is. And maybe it's like a slow, non-surprising strategy of what we are announcing or what we're presenting. But at the end of the day, it's about having products that work, products that give you the operational simplicity that you need, and slowly expanding across what our customers want and where the applications are going. This is what we are doing. And just the agenda for today, finishing with this, unless there is any question. We are going to start with, I guess, the one that is the more newsy. Velo is now part of the team. We are very excited to have them, and our customers have been, as you were saying, asking for this type of solution for a while. So we are very excited to finally be able to deliver that solution and work together with the Velo team to have a product that addresses their needs. The second topic is going to double-click on what's going on in NSXT and containers and cloud. And this is one of the elements that of course, is more newsy, more happening, and where we are getting a lot of traction and interest. And the third is, let's not forget what's kind of the workhorse of the group. Basically, NSX is growing very fast in the vSphere environments, extending now into clouds and so on. So what's coming in, why is it interesting, what our customers care? We are going to cover all this and all the security associated features in the third section. This is the agenda for today. Of course, there were many topics we could cover, but we felt that since you guys have seen probably some of the transformations and announcements that we had over the years, these were the three topics that probably will bring you more information on the new things that are going on in the group.